So welcome everyone to Emptying the Pews, Life After Conservative Christianity. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder, along with my partner, Don Jokum, Bureau of General Services Queer Division. Thank you very much. Bureau is a government agency for a government that does not exist. And this is the service that we provide, holding this room for queer folks in queer culture. So thanks for coming out today. I'm very excited about this event because I too have survived sort of Christianity. So it's a topic that's very close to my heart, which is why I reached out to Laura and Chrissy to say, please do something. I want to do more. I want to be louder. So I'm so happy that this book exists, Empty the Pews, and that it's out in the world. And we could host you all to talk about this topic. So I'm going to introduce Lauren and Chrissy, and then we'll get started. Oh, but I forgot. I am holding a bag for donations. So we are an all-volunteer bookstore. That's right. Grab your wallets.
We're not that far up.
Somebody said, whenever I hear the word culture, I pull out my checkbook. Whenever you hear queer bookstore, pull out your checkbook. So yeah, we depend on donations and book sales to keep this project going. So yeah, if you want to buy a book rather than make a donation, that is completely valid. I encourage you to do so. We have books by each and every one of our campus here. So I'll pass that around. There's change in there if you need it. I also wanted to mention that if you're not on our email list, you can sign up for that at the back of the room. And you'll get an email every other Monday about our upcoming events, many of which are book related, but not all of them. And we also have changing exhibitions in here. Our current show is Satanic Academy. Satan's in the house. My Catalina Schliebelin, and this show is up through January. All right, now I'm going to introduce you. We're going to jump on in. So Lauren O'Neill is a writer and editor in New York City. She is the co-editor with Chrissy Stroop of the essay anthology Empty the Pews, Stories of Leaving the Church, and the co-host of the podcast Sunday School Dropouts. Her writing has appeared in Slate, Nylon, and a bunch of websites that don't exist. The co-editor with Lauren O'Neill of Empty the Pews, Stories of Leaving the Church, an anthology of personal essays by former conservative Christians. Chrissy Stroop was raised evangelical, subjected to intense indoctrination in Christian schools. Now a vocal critic of the Christian right and an atheist, Stroop is a senior correspondent for Religion Dispatches and a columnist for Open Democracy. She holds a PhD in modern Russian history from Stanford University, and her work has also appeared in Foreign Policy, the Boston Globe, Playboy, Dame Magazine, Alternate, The Conversationalist, and other outlets, including peer-reviewed academic journals. An advocate for pluralist coexistence as an essential component of healthy democratic society, Stroop is proud of her record of working with both religious and secular organizations in pursuit of the common good. Stroop came out as a transgender woman in 2019 and currently resides in Portland. So please welcome them and all of our panelists.
Hi.
Hey.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just going to introduce the rest of our panelists who are either contributors to the anthology or, in Danny's case, a blurber of the anthology. To my left is Daniel Lavery. He is the author of texts from Jane Eyre and Something That May Shock and Discredit You, the co-founder of The Toast, and the former Dear Prudence at Slate. Then we have Carmen Maria Machado, the author of the best-selling memoir In the Dream House and the award-winning short story collection Her Body and Other Parties. She's been a finalist for the National Book Award and many other awards. Her writing has appeared in the New Yorker, the New York Times, Granta, Vogue, and elsewhere. She holds an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop and has been awarded fellowships and residencies from the Guggenheim Foundation, Yaddo, Hedgebrook, and the Millay Colony for the Arts. And then all the way over at the end, we have Maud Newton, who has written for the New York Times Magazine, Harper's, the New York Times Book Review, and Oxford American. She grew up in Miami and graduated from the University of Florida with degrees in English and law. Hi, everyone. So I just wanted to start by having everybody kind of summarize their relationship with with conservative Christianity? Just, like real quick, casual. So I'm just going to ask you the question that I used to ask all the guests on my podcast, which is, what is your religious background?
Sure. Hi, I'm Danny. I think that slightly further afield from conservative Christianity, I have a background in general evangelical Christianity, but like upwardly mobile, distant North Midwestern roots. So, it was more like go to J. Crew and buy what's off the mannequin than conservative, if that makes sense. Not that those things are necessarily at odds, but I do think that's an important like aesthetic and cultural distinction. And I don't go to church, so that's that.
I have kind of a strange path. I was raised like sort of very middle of the road, United Methodist. My parents, my mom was raised Catholic, my dad was raised Baptist, so Methodism was like the compromise somehow. And it was pretty chill. And then at some point when I was a teenager, I was like, I'm not feeling enough feelings. I want to feel something. And it turns out I actually wanted to like have an orgasm, but I didn't know that at the time. So I became like an evangelical, like I like fell into the gang of evangelicals at my school, and was just really, really religious for some portion of my life, of my young life, to feel things. And I'm no longer. Oh, that's right.
Well done.
Thank you. Yes, you can do that with one. Okay, so I was born and mostly raised in Indiana, and my parents, they came from sort of like mainline, not go to church every Sunday sort of backgrounds, but they had their like evangelical conversion experiences in college in the 1970s, as so many people of that generation did. So I grew up with it always being the end times and Christ might come back any time. And, my mom became a Christian school teacher when I was pretty young. I went to public school for kindergarten, and then I was shifted over to the Christian school. They used to give you tuition waivers back in those days for teachers' kids. Now it's usually just like a discount that increases with seniority, and they still expect every teacher to send their kids there. The only way you can get out of it basically is if you get expelled, which I was always way too much of a goody two shoes to do. So, even after middle school, I wanted to go to public school, but they wouldn't let me. Young Earth creationism, lots of like fear mongering. As soon as you're like 5 or 6 years old, it's like there are all these liberals out there killing babies and we have to stop them. And can you believe that gay people want to have rights? This is terrible. So, and then the funny thing is, for a lot of people in that environment, the denomination doesn't matter, right? So we went to, let's see, when I was born, it was a missionary church, then a Wesleyan church, then a Baptist church. Then my dad became the music pastor at an independent Christian church, Restoration Movement branch. Slightly less crazy than the Church of Christ. Then we did this church plant in Colorado Springs, Colorado. So I spent 1993 to 1995 out there. It was like, we got there like a year after Focus on the Family moved there. Headquarters from Southern California to Colorado Springs. So it was becoming what Colorado Springs is now, which is this horrible evangelical dystopia with a bunch of other cool people who are just trying to get by. I started really breaking away as a teenager, but it was a long, slow, painful, protracted process. And I couldn't even recognize my own queerness until I was 33, because I was always just living in my head and figuring I had to just solve this crisis of faith thing. And, now it's like, it's great that there are LGBTQ affirming churches and that sort of thing. But for my own personal self, like, I just don't really want to deal with theology or God anymore. I mean, if people are going to debate whether being queer is okay with God or not, and that's a matter of theology, then I feel like it would make, queer existence a problem. No theology, no problem. So that works for me.
I remember the Satanic Panic well, because I was born in 1971. So I'm going to try to keep this as short as I can. Basically, my parents were sort of nominally Christian in that they prayed, they said grace at dinner. Then they became jointly Presbyterian, and I accepted Jesus into my heart when I was 3, so that if I died, I wouldn't be stuck in hell crying out for a glass of water and my parents couldn't save me. So that was like kind of a lot, but it was actually pretty run of the mill, you know, right, as Protestants go. But then my mother had a swift and feverish conversion and became obsessed with demons and started her own church in our living room, which involved casting out demons and speaking in tongues and all of that. My father was super not into that. So he was really into the idea of predestination. He's not the most empathetic person, to put it mildly. So yeah, so anyway, there was kind of like a religious schism in my house. But all the while I was going to a Christian school that had yet a third kind of evangelical Christianity that was sort of close to Baptist. My parents tried to compromise on a bunch of different denominations. We were kicked out of the Baptist church actually because of my mom. And so in any case, I feel like I've had exposure to a super wide variety of evangelical Christianity and the ways that it can be intolerant and make people hate themselves.
Thank you. The next question I want to ask is like, how does your history, the histories that you've just described, still affect you today? How does it show up in your writing? How does it show up in your life? Anything like that?
I like to, or at least I would like to, have a relationship that feels rather loose and light. It's not, I think, one of the primary focuses of my writing, although certainly like the year or two surrounding my sort of like particular break with my own evangelical family, that was different out of necessity. But I like to think of it as something that I can continue to develop like resilience and lightness of spirit around, rather than feel like if I could have changed this one thing about my past, my life would have been better. I think in part that can be a really like consoling fantasy that can eventually become like counterproductive and even painful, like because you cannot go back and change it. And because I tend to think like there would probably have been another, you know, system or way of believing or way of relating to other people that would have shaped my childhood and could potentially led to harm. So I try to think of it, certainly, you know, there's times that it feels good to talk with somebody and say, boy, that was nuts, can't believe we did that. Or this was really painful, you know, I want to try to heal from it. And certainly, you know, that's not the way that I live my life now. It wouldn't be something that I would ever want to base any way of relating with other people on nowadays. But yeah, I want to wear it like a light jacket in Northern California that could take off when the wind dies down, and not as a sort of like wound that I must always carry with me or relitigate. I say all that, that's like a goal. That's not always how I feel or experience it, but that is something that I do want for myself.
That is so beautiful, and I feel like now I want to rethink how I've been relating. Like I want it to be that jacket. That's like so.
I want that.
What a lovely image! What a lovely idea. I mean, I feel like I maybe in some similar ways, like think of it as like a necessary part of my development. Like I think of it as, I mean, both the part of it that was like the church that I sort of went to in the larger sense, like from when I was a child until, you know, I sort of fell away from it, and this choice that I made to get really evangelical, really religious at this like moment in my life, because they did also like serve me in ways that I needed them to when I was young. Like it wasn't an accident that I like chose like a sort of even different path than the one I was on, because there was something in it that I needed and some sort of way of thinking about things. And I also wish I maybe I'd had different tools at my disposal. Like I was also sort of using, I think, this conservative evangelical stuff to sort of, you said let the word litigate, which is interesting, to like relitigate stuff around purity and sexual violence. And so for me, like there was a way that I was sort of making a choice. Like I had this really good friend, and I think actually the thing that kind of started us on this path was we were reading this book called And the Bride Wore White, which was this, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this book, but it was like really big in like the 2000s, and it was like about purity culture. It was like it was like, so you want to be pure, here's a book for that. And so we were doing like exercises from it, and we were like, and we were both like at that point maybe 13, And we were both sort of negotiating and navigating like our own experiences of sexual violence and sort of followed it into our own paths. So I followed it into this like evangelical, again, gang at school, and my friend Carla followed it into like really conservative Catholicism, where she actually still remains. That was her path, and she kind of remains on that path. But so for me, it was necessary. And also, it was source of a great deal of pain and like a great deal of bad choices and things that kind of affected me much later. So, and for my writing, the writing question is actually really interesting because I've been working on some new projects right now where I'm actually been researching a lot about bottoming. I'm trying to like come up with this like cohesive theory of bottoming. And so I find myself reading a lot of books about like the mystics and about like submission to the mystery. And I find myself like re-exploring and re-examining all these questions that I thought I had left far behind me. And like reading a lot of books about religion and like thinking a lot about, again, that desire to like be in the presence of something large and great and like something that you can't quite explain and that you want to like be in submission to. And so I feel like there's something kind of interesting about how I'm now like thinking of these questions again, which I never thought I would. It's been kind of interesting. So yeah, definitely a thing that like remains, but I feel like I have more of a healthy relationship, like what these thoughts can sort of do for me. I feel like my relationship with it is just really different.
So, I was born in 1980 and kind of straight into what I see now as the evangelical indoctrination machine. This was the height of the homeschooling movement and the Christian schools movement. Those things did start a little bit earlier, but from the 1980s, like the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, which is the most important Christian right lobby you've never heard of, was working very hard to deregulate homeschooling across the country to great success. And I think most of the American public just sort of blinked at that. And Christian schools were, of course, quite unregulated too, for the most part. I mean, I did go to one that was college prep and had some AP classes. It was really weird. I call it the elite culture warrior track because they were trying to prepare us for, going out into the world to fight battles. And so, to take the country back for Christ, that created a lot of cognitive dissonance for me, though, because I got to be taught logical fallacies and how to write well in the form of an argument. But I do owe some of my, writing successes to my English teachers at Christian schools. Yeah, I mean, it's, you don't get a redo on your childhood socialization, The way that I look at it now is sort of that, there's whole generations of kids who were basically subjected to a large-scale experiment in social engineering without our consent. I mean, not that kids could consent to anything like that, because you're simply taught from birth all these, sort of alternative facts, and and they are reinforced consistently across sort of most of aspects of your social life. Like when I got little peeks outside of our little world, I think that was part of, ultimately deconstructing that kind of faith, because my family was no strict as some, even though my parents worked in ministry. So I got to do like community theater and stuff and meet people who were different. But most of our social life was Christian school and church. Everybody believed the same things. They didn't particularly care what denomination you were or like where you came down on predestination versus free will, but they cared that you believed that the Bible was literally true. The world was created in 6 days, 6 to 10,000 years ago. Abortion is evil and everyone should vote for Republicans. I mean, that's, that was the most important theology. And voting for Republicans was definitely part of the theology. So how does that affect myself and my writing now? I mean, I do mostly write, at the moment, political commentary, opinion pieces, and a lot of it has to do with the Christian right. So it's always kind of there, and sometimes I wish that I could move on from it and write about other things, but it's just kind of the natural beat that I fell into, and maybe I won't be stuck with it forever, but hopefully I'm doing something valuable in the meantime.
I think maybe like Danny, I don't want to put words in Danny's mouth, but I have a lot of empathy for the impulses that led my mom down the path that she went down. You know, in a lot of ways, she had a really serious humanitarian streak. She, you know, there's a lot of mental illness in my family, especially on her side. And, you know, to some extent, I include myself in that. And so, you know, I really, I feel a lot of empathy around it. And as I've gotten older, what I've found, I recently, in March, I published a book called Ancestor Trouble. And among other things in that book, I really looked back at my family and the extreme history of evangelical Christianity going all the way back to the Puritans. I had an ancestor who was accused of being a witch. She was tried, she beat the charges. And when I first discovered that, I thought, like, wow, how fucking badass is that? You know? But then the more I sort of looked at her story, the more I realized that that family used religion as a sword and a shield. They made an example of a Black woman and sentenced her to public lashes when the rumors of being a witch resurfaced again for my 9th great grandmother. And so I see this history in my family of this really twisted relationship to a feeling of being chosen, a feeling of being protected, and a desire to know the divine. And I see that twisted throughout our culture. And so I'm really interested in looking at my own family and all of these histories as a lens for our larger culture, because I think, you know, you can see with QAnon how this kind of thing can be secularized and, you know, used to whip people up.
So not all Christianity is conservative. There are liberal LGBT affirming churches. There's one like right across the street. There are progressive and queer Christians, probably some in this room. What is your relationship with a more liberal Christianity? Do you think that's progress? Do you think that's a contradiction in terms? Nice, but not for me. How does it strike you?
It's just, I just want to say, I'm just so pleased to be here with you all. I'm so grateful for hearing all of your stories. I just find it's very meaningful and moving, and I'm glad to be here. You know, and of course, that's such like an open and complicated question. I have felt differently about that throughout my lifetime. You know, I remember in like the mid-aughts when like Christopher Harris, Richard, and Sam Harris,
Yes.
and Richard Dawkins were everywhere, and just like if you, yeah, just one of them, and just like
They all combine into one meta.
I'm just like this sort of like deeply unpleasant, you know, energy that I, you know, the little stinker in me was deeply drawn to, but so I'm often wanting to be like wary of that. I suppose, anyways, all of this is a sort of preamble for, I think that's part of why I had mentioned earlier, I'm not sure exactly that I come from conservative Christianity. Like, we came from a church where people really prided themselves on, we're not creationists. Most of our kids go to public schools. We kind of, and I think that had more to do with like middle class upward mobility than anything else, because I think it would have really been like, well, people who believe in the literal Bible are poor, and we're not poor. So it was not like, oh, this rich intellectual tradition. It was just middle class social strivers trying to put as much you know, the old saying that Methodists are Baptists who can read, and Presbyterians are Methodists who have gone to college, and Episcopalians are Presbyterians who have joined the social register. And like, I mean, again, like growing up, you know, I grew up in a sundown town in suburban Illinois. So I didn't even, like, we were miles away from the nearest social register. Like, but I heard about it in junior high. And like, I think in some ways, like my gayness was first expressed as like a different kind of social climbing, which I think sometimes happens to certain like rural gay children, which is just like, I'm gonna be a star, don't you know who I am? And, very like, the social register, I better get on that post haste. So all of this is to say, I came from a religious background that prided itself on integrating with the mainstream culture, but in the sort of way that led to like national prayer breakfasts and like the overwhelming impact of like evangelicals, not just on like far right-wing elements of the culture, but like TED Talks and Obama. Like, and that sort of like idea of recuperative religious faith that was like, we can get you the mainstream, we can get you an intellectual gloss, and doesn't this look nice? And none of that is to say, by the way, that I think that it's not like worthwhile or meaningful to have like a religious framework that enables you to live well with others. I think there's many ways for that to be possible, including within Christianity. And I want that for anyone who wants to be able to access it. But there was also underneath it, like a really unhealthy and unsavory dominionism that just wore sweaters from J. Crew, for which like the liberal arts education was truly just a varnish. And so, for at least some of the just brief background for me, I think one of the reasons I talked about I want to wear it like a light coat is I sometimes walk around with a little bit of swagger because I got my father fired. And sometimes I feel like he's not allowed to be a minister, or like he's allowed, and I'm sure there's some churches that would like him even better now. But so I feel a little bit like, yeah, I like did it. I solved the edible problem. I totally did, right? Like my nonchalance towards my religious upbringing is like purchased at this like expensive. Have you ever played Civilization 6? So it's like a game where you like build a civilization, and like I get really upset at it, and I love it very much. And I've played 1,000 hours recently. And thank you. I like to set it to like all my best settings, but one of them is like how many natural disasters you want to experience. And no matter how low you turn it down, sometimes volcanoes still erupts. I promise this is relevant. And like when that happens, I get so mad. And I'll say to my wife, who's here in the audience, and it's wonderful, I'll say, that's not fair. She knows now at this point that what she has to say back to me is, it is not fair, you are right. And that's a little bit like what it feels like. Like I can afford to be sort of nonchalant and breezy about evangelicalism because like I live like, which is an ongoing like volcano of like, I hate my father. I don't want to brag, but like probably more than anyone else here. And I know that most of us hate our fathers. And I'm like, there's nothing that could happen to him that's bad enough that would satisfy me. Like if you could make hell and put him in it and just give me, what's the phrase for that? The Dolores pleasure or something?
Oh, I can't think of it.
Sorry. Anyways, I should wrap this up. This is getting sadistic. I would never.
They're all transfixed, actually.
There's an actual term for it, and it is something like the Dolores pleasure. The abominable fancy. Thank you. And it refers to specifically, and again, this is not all mainstream Christianity, but like certain weird sects, which is like the pleasure that somebody in heaven gets from watching the suffering of the damned. I really relate to that. I think I could watch my father suffer in hell for forever. It would never be enough. And that's not how I would actually like to spend my life. And so it's a little bit like living next to a volcano that you have set to 0, but still sometimes it's like, fuck you, I'm gonna go off. And so I have to find other ways of living. For me, that doesn't look like reintegration into like a liberalist Christian framework. In my experience, that was covering up for equally damaging, evil, white supremacist, sexually dangerous, dangerous to the well-being of children mindset that was all the more insidious for looking so plausible. But I think that's it. I think I'll stop with that.
Danny, how am I supposed to follow that?
What's your dad?
Oh my God! It's complicated, but I do love him, and I don't want to see him in hell. So, yeah, you definitely hate your dad more than me. And then I hate my dad.
Liberal Christianity, what do you think?
Right. Oh God. I feel like for me, it's so interesting because my there's a friend of a friend who I met, who I see very occasionally, who is Catholic and is planning on becoming a nun. And every time we interact, I have this funny thought, and she's lovely. I'm always like, you might be the only of your type that I ever meet. Like there's something really interesting about like, because also she's like, I love gay people. Like I don't like, she's like a liberal version of the thing. But also I'm like, but you're going to become a nun. I like don't fully understand how like she is kind of personally integrating like a lot of this stuff, the realities of Catholicism, which is also, I should add, I feel like, so like my mother was raised Catholic. I have a lot of feelings of Catholicism specifically, even though that was not the faith that I sort of grew up in. And so that in particular kind of always like rankled me because I'm like, it's so organized. Like it feels way more organized than like the other. I mean, I guess that's not true because like all of these faith, they're organized on some level, but like Catholicism feels so big and old and fucked up, like especially so. Like in this like Buffy villain kind of way, like more than like a lot of the others. And so I do feel like I have a weirdly hostile relationship with that church in particular. And I think I have very little patience when I meet sort of Catholics who are like, but I believe in gay people, but I believe in this, but I believe, and I'm always like, but there's a man telling, there's like literally like one guy, like there's like, it's so organized and it's so specific. And there's actually so little room for this, wiggle room for this, that I actually don't fully understand how you could actually say, I am like pro-gay rights, for example, or like pro-choice, and also be Catholic or think of yourself as Catholic. And I don't actually know how to reconcile those things. So I actually feel like I have very weirdly little patience for like so-called conservative or progressive Christianity, or like people who, which is not to say that like it isn't possible. And I'm sure there are probably people in my life, possibly there are people in my life who are afraid to tell me that they are religious in a weird turn of like, you know, it's like someone not wanting to come out to me, but like not come out to me as a Christian, because I probably would have like a weird reaction to it, because I do actually feel like it's a little bit like, it's none of my business, like a little bit like, well, if you believe that, I don't think those things are compatible in any way, but sure, that's fine. Like, you know, people believe stuff all the time, and you believe in astrology, whatever, like it's none of my, you know, if that works for you, it works for you. But a part of it too does make me actually really furious, because I feel like it does feel like this cognitive dissonance that I actually don't really know what to do with, and I find very sort of personally aggravating, which is maybe like more of like a very hostile answer. I don't mean to be hostile, but yeah, like I feel like I actually don't have a lot of patience for that sort of thing, and I feel like I'd get into a real, if I had like one beer in me, I feel like I'd get into a really nasty fight about that. Somebody that I liked, somebody that I was like friends with, or like a friend of a friend, I feel like I could get into a big old fight about that. Because yeah, there's something about it that just feels very, and it, you know, where it's like you believe in a thing, like if you believe what you believe to be literally true, then like these ostensible progressive values you have actually don't feel consistent. And I've just, yeah, I find it very frustrating.
Well, you know, one of my mantras that I always come back to is that shared values are more important than shared beliefs. So, you know, if we want to work in this country toward the common good, religion, Christianity, you know, do I think it's a good thing that overall the percentage of Christians in America is declining and the percentage of non-religious people is rising? Yes, I do, because Christian hegemony, Christian privilege, there are real problems in our society that we don't talk about enough. At the same time, when I find myself, you know, giving a talk for an atheist or a humanist organization, I often, you know, bring up how casual anti-theism is a real turnoff, and it's not, it's counterproductive if we need to think about things like building coalitions for advocacy. You know, that has to be done across faith and non-faith lines. It has to be done sometimes through interfaith dialogue, and you can't just leave religious people completely out of it. And certainly you can't leave, you can't just take all the other religious people and not have any Christians around. Now, that being said, you know, sometimes liberal Christians do bother me, particularly when they're very dismissive of the kind of Christianity that, you know, I experienced. So if they tell you like, oh, that's not real Christianity, or that's not how Christianity is supposed to be, you know, I start to get mad. And a lot of my essays that I write, they come out of things that really annoy me. So I have written several times on, why liberal Christians dismissing evangelicals and fundamentalists as fake Christians is a means of reinforcing Christian cultural hegemony and Christian privilege. That is unhelpful, and it also, from a religious studies point of view, it simply is not accurate. Christians are what they do in the world with their texts and traditions, right? So prescriptive take on what Christianity is inside baseball. They can debate theology among themselves, but we don't all have access to, like one arbiter of who is right. They can't show us God and he'll be, oh yeah, they're right, everyone else is wrong. Like that doesn't happen. So they're all Christians, right? I think it's equally unhelpful, which is sometimes the atheists do when they say that, oh, only the fundamentalists are the real believers. They're the only ones who really believe things. And, these liberal Christians, they just want to be atheists, but they're too scared to do it. Like that's also super unhelpful. So, I also have some really good progressive Christian friends and colleagues, people that I've been happy to work with. I've worked several times with the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, which is a national organization. And then I'm from Indiana originally. I've done stuff with the Indiana Coalition for Reproductive Justice. I've worked with, social justice pastors and theologians. And, I often leave feeling really good about Christianity for like 5 minutes. And, then I see a Jesus fish on a car or, some bumper sticker about love them both or whatever. I'm like, oh yeah, I hate Christianity again. But, so it's complicated, but I really like my dad. So, he's been a music pastor all my life, but through weird twisted events, long story short, he was in evangelical churches, but becoming less and less really a good fit for them. But, when you're getting toward retirement age, how are you going to do anything else? He kind of got pushed out of his last position in evangelical church, which was back in the independent Christian church restoration movement. Because I think they all sort of thought he was too liberal for them, which he actually was. And he just kind of got stabbed in the back. It's something that happens in conservative churches and these kinds of institutional environments all the time. When your parents work in ministry, you see how the sausage is made. And thankfully, he was able to turn to an old friend who used to be a professional job recruiter, but gave that up after Monster.com came along and all of that. Helped him get his resume all together, and he ended up getting a job in a mainline church. It's an ELCA Lutheran church, the good Lutherans. And it's it's officially an LGBTQ affirming church. Dad and mom don't always get like my pronouns and name change right and everything. They're trying. I think especially dad is getting a little better at it, but mom's getting a little better too. And I think mom probably still is like in the, oh yeah, it's a sin to be who you are, Chrissy camp, but she doesn't want to say that out loud. She's like, well, Jesus just said love everybody, and that's what they're not. I guess my dad is a progressive Christian now. I think my mom is not, but we're able to get along, and that wasn't really part of the question. But but Danny talked about it, so I wanted to talk about it too. Anyway.
I think it's all part of the question. Sorry, Carmen, what did
I
you
just
say?
don't ask everyone about their dads. We're gonna rant.
I don't hate my dad, but we have been estranged for more than 20 years. And I'm very comfortable with that. And I wish him well and happiness insofar as he can be happy in a way that doesn't involve harming other people. And for more on my dad, you can read my book, or you can read my essay on the word y'all in the New York Times Magazine today. Thanks. But yeah, so I think one great thing about my childhood and this sort of religious schism in my family is that, so first of all, I became a Christian within the memory of my childhood. And then within a few years, my parents had completely opposing views of what that meant. And so in a weird way, I mean, it was horrible when my mom was literally ripping pages out of the Bible in our front yard and screaming at him about his church and their doctrinal differences and whatnot. But it was great because I sort of saw the arbitrariness of, you know, the differences between them. And, you know, while I was because of the way I was raised and my father in particular, I was very willing to believe in a tyrannical God. But I never really experienced the sort of like loving God thing. That wasn't really emphasized. It was more like believe in God or you will go to hell. And so when I somehow persuaded them to let me go to public high school and my mom shut down her church, I was just kind of like, I am free, you know, this is fantastic. Then later though, you know, the fear and all of it cropped up at one point, and I did try converting to the Episcopal Church. I was not on the social register. But I did try, and I think my feeling now is that I don't see a point of access for myself in Christianity at all. But, you know, I really take seriously, you know, Sarah Schulman's book on ACT UP. She writes about the importance of intersectionality, the importance of working with groups that you don't completely agree with. And, you know, so I volunteer, for example, at the like senior breakfast with the Episcopal Church in my neighborhood. And I think they're a little befuddled by me, but that's fine. It's good for them. And, you know, I have some friends who are Christian, and that's cool. Peace be with you. You know, that's kind of my feeling about it.
I don't think it's I have one more question, then we're going to open it up to the audience for questions. For people who have left Christianity or who are currently in the process of leaving Christianity, do you have any advice you'd give or resources you would point them toward? It's a really lovely question. I'm not sure that I have a great answer. So I would just encourage anyone who is leaving or in the process of leaving to seek out as many other options as interest them. You know, you have the whole rest of the world available to you, so feel really free to try more than one thing, to, you know, go really far in one direction and then find you've hit a bumper and go far in another direction, and not to feel like the first thing that gets you out is necessarily going to be the only thing that stays with you. That would be it.
Lovely. When I left like a faith practice and I was no longer going to church, one of the first things I did was I joined Toastmasters. Wait, really? Oh. I was in Toastmasters, and I was the youngest person there by like 30 years very easily, and it was at a local church. It was a Lyz Lenz at the time. It was at a church. I mean, it wasn't, you know, and I think a lot of people actually there might have gone to that church, but they were just like older, like lovely, kind people who like were just like, what are you doing here exactly? Okay, yeah, come on, you know. And there were literally snacks. Like it felt like I was going to church, but I was at Toastmasters. And it was actually really soothing. Like it soothed this part of me that I think was feeling very like hungry for this community that I had lost, that had been such an important part of my life. So I think the note about, I mean, that was not my forever home. You know, I found other things to fill that space. But I also, it was actually really nice to have this like stepping stone that like felt a little bit like it. I mean, it also smelled like a church, so that really helps. Like the bit, like, I mean, you know, it had that distinctly, you know, that basement-y kind of smell. Like it's, you know, but also like, there were just like people there who would like, I would see every week, and it was really good to see them. And there were snacks, and there were things that just made me feel like, you know, where I had to sit down and like, you know, listen to someone else speak. And like, it sort of scratched that itch a little bit for me. And then, yeah, then eventually I found other things, and, you know, that became, you know, part of my past. But I think, yeah, like like there's a reason that you were there, and maybe the reason is that you were born into it or your family did it, but like there were things that kept you there. There were things, like there were pleasures that it offered you, and I think finding out what are those, like articulating like what were the pleasures that it offered me, whether it's community or whatever, or snacks, and like figuring out what the pleasure was, and then like tracking the pleasure to wherever you can find it elsewhere, I think is like a good way of like soothing, like that piece of you that like was looking for something, because that part of you is that has that, is valuable, and it's like we're listening to, even if the thing that you're using to fill it is not this particular practice.
So, just from a sociological perspective, in the United States, it can be really difficult to find community outside of a specifically sort of religious institutional setting. So a lot of people do feel a lot of lack there, if that's been a big part of their entire life. And this is often true for ex-evangelicals, people who went to Christian school or were homeschooled, may have missed out on a lot of pop culture references of people from the same generation, may find it difficult to sort of socially integrate in certain places. So sometimes I think it does help to just be able to communicate with other people who have been there. And in terms of resources for that sort of thing, starting in about 2015, I was a part of kind of building up some online spaces for what we call ex-evangelicals or ex-Vs. And then, a lot of like ex-Mormons and ex-Jehovah's Witnesses have also joined in these conversations. We use a lot of hashtags on Twitter. Hashtag Empty the Pews, which then became the title of the book, was one that I coined in 2017. Hashtag ex-evangelical, I think a year before or so, or a little before that, maybe Blake Chastain coined that one. And, that one is still used a lot, especially these days on Instagram and TikTok, which I don't really use much, but I probably should try to learn how, even though I'm 42 years old and it seems very intimidating to use TikTok. But ex-evangelical, apparently that hashtag recently passed, I think, 1 billion views on TikTok. So there are active discussions happening there. We also, back around 2015, 2016, we created this Facebook support group called Ex-Evangelical, and eventually became so big that we made a bunch of like little like branches for more specific things that people might want to discuss from that background. And yeah, I think it's got well over 10,000 members at this point. So I was an admin for a while, but I don't pay that close attention to it now that I've kind of stepped back from that. But those kinds of spaces, they're not necessarily going to be the kind of space where you're going to stay for your whole life, but they can help. Sometimes I think with the initial processing, they're not a replacement for therapy, of course. But for me personally, there was a lot of validation in just like connecting with people, even online, who just also kind of understood what it was like, growing up that way. So yeah, I would recommend that you might look into that sort of thing. And then also the kind of advice I would give to people is not to be too hung up on, where they land, whether it's in some kind of Christianity, in, no religion, in a different religion or spiritual path. Like, don't let anybody be gatekeepy about that. Don't let people be prescriptive. Just embrace your process, become the person that you're discovering yourself to be. And so, yeah, experiment. I mean, a lot of people who come from evangelical backgrounds join mainline churches. Some don't stay very long. I tried to be Episcopalian. Yeah.
Were you on the social register?
No, I was socially like such a fish out of water. But it was, they were very sweet people at St. Bede's in Menlo Park, California. But, I got confirmed Episcopalian in February 2012 and had stopped going to church by like October of that year. I'd also moved to Moscow, Russia. And so I didn't want to drag myself out to the one Anglican church there, which is like 20 minutes from the nearest subway station. But eventually I was like, I don't want to go to church anymore. Yeah. Also, my car was broken into on the day I got confirmed by the bishop in the parking lot of Menlo Park, or of St. Bede's in Menlo Park. And, there were people there who were like, oh, you should totally subscribe to this, like, identity theft protection thing that's like $1,000 a month. And I'm like, you really have no idea what my social reality is, do you? I think that was also part of why I was like, yeah, I can't become Episcopalian. It's just not socially possible for me.
Yeah, I think that, you know, the point that everyone has made about finding community is really important, whatever that means for the individual person. And yeah, I mean, TikTok seems like, you know, both a like terrifying place for young people to turn, but also like a place that can offer really immense support. You know, when that's lacking in a community. Obviously, I'm going to say that books are important, you know, books like Empty the Pews, which Lauren and Chrissy put together, and I and Carmen contributed to. Also, you know, there are so many other great books by ex-evangelicals. There's Garrard Conley's Boy Erased, which is about his experience with conversion therapy.
He also contributed to Empty the Pews.
I wondered, yeah. And then actually my friend Gina Kadlik has this book coming out called Heretic on Tuesday. I brought it just to, I'm gonna give this away to like the first person who wants it and asks me, because it's just such a beautiful book. And of course you should also buy books here at the bookstore. You know, but you know, one thing that I would say, you know, just for myself is that for many years I clenched around this idea of agnosticism, which is a weird thing to clench around, but I considered myself a fervent agnostic, and I was really closed off to spiritual possibility, you know, because I had experienced so much religious trauma when I was young. And people like Gina and myself, you know, my book sort of takes a spiritual turn toward the end. You know, I'm just really heartened by the ways that people are trying to find spiritual meaning. I'm not too hung up on the sort of objective truth around any of that, but just sort of more earth honoring, open-ended ways of relating to the world around us that have a spiritual tinge.
Thank you so much. Does anybody in the audience have any questions? Yes. Yes.
Hi. So I don't know if all of you can answer this question, or maybe it's more of a question for Chrissy. Is I grew up homeschooled, evangelical. What I now look back on is probably kind of fundamentalist, but like non-denominational Baptist, whatever. I don't know, homeschooling. And I often wonder now if I'm sort of like replaying or replicating like a fundamentalist mindset or approach to like the values I have now, because I mean, I do think it's important for more people to understand like the harms of evangelical homeschooling, for example, and like particular types of Christianity, and also all of the anti-human rights and views that a lot of conservative Christians hold. And I find myself very, very committed to that now, and I just wonder sometimes, like, am I still kind of a fundamentalist? But like with new things, and also is that a bad thing? So I guess I'm wondering if any of you think about that, relate to that, or yeah.
Yeah, so the question for anyone who couldn't hear it is, if you grew up in a fundamentalist or, you know, somewhat fundamentalist background, how do you not necessarily avoid applying that mindset in the present, but how do you grapple with wondering if you're applying that mindset in the present, even though you have a different set of beliefs?
You know, I think I'll start by giving an answer that was sort of similar to the answer I got from adults that I talked to during the 1 week when I was totally convinced I committed the unpardonable sin and blasphemed against the Holy Spirit, and I was going to go to hell no matter what I did, which was the fact that you're, you know, asking, have I committed the unpardonable sin, means that you haven't. So, you know, I think the fact that you're asking, am I replicating fundamentalist patterns here, just being cognizant of that is a really good practice, because it is certainly possible. And I have seen this sometimes happen. in, you know, the kinds of like ex-evangelical online spaces that we were building for the last 7 or 8 years, is that sometimes people do get caught in very black and white thinking. Lots of gatekeeping can be problematic, but just to think that no, you know, it's important, the public needs to know that evangelical homeschooling and Christian schools is harmful. I mean, I'm right with you there. I don't think that makes you fundamentalist or that that is a bad thing. I think that's a good thing. It's kind of been my crusade too for the, you know, since around 2015 or so, when I finally, you know, made this big public break with evangelicalism, and I published this essay on, you know, people were celebrating because Tony Campolo had finally become LGBTQ affirming, which if you don't know who Tony Campolo is, he's like, you know, he's been a sort of liberal evangelical preacher, famous preacher for a pretty long time, to the point that a lot of evangelicals are like, why are you evangelical again? Wait, how are you really one of us? But, you know, but he couldn't cross that line of, you know, it's okay to be gay until, you know, around 2015. And then, you know, all your sort of like Wheaton graduates who write for the New York Times, the Wheaton College is in Illinois, a big evangelical university, you know, like, oh yeah, yeah. And I was like, come on, you guys, you're celebrating this one guy's change, but this is not what most of evangelicalism still is. Like most of it is still like very, very anti-LGBTQ. And so I wrote this pretty scathing essay, and I wrote it for Religion Dispatches, but then it got picked up by Salon and Alternate and kind of went viral. And I was getting all these text messages from my aunt, my sister, how can you do this to your mother? How can you make your mother so sad? You know? The point is, I don't think that was a bad thing to do. I think it was part of a path of moving toward authenticity and realizing that, yeah, the public doesn't get where we come from, and it would really be very helpful if they did. So, okay, maybe I rambled a little too much about that, but you know, I don't think that just because you're fighting sort of the culture wars on the other side, that makes you a fundamentalist of a different sort. Like, I think it's necessary to fight back without falling back into black and white, total black and white thinking, you know, if that makes sense.
Does anyone else have any thoughts? Wonderful. Any other questions? Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks, kids. I can go back a lot further than you can. Advantage in a way. I'd like to know, you talk about Christian public education. Have I got the phrase right? Christian public schools. I remember those from the fucking South. I was a son of that. I could tell you stories that you whatever hairs you had. But in the meanwhile, Christian public schools were set up to avoid the integration of the public schools. Was that true in the cases, because you're coming from somewhere else? It was just simple racism. And I wonder if that sort of racism was in the situation where you are.
Yeah, so the question is, in the South, a lot of Christian private schools were set up pretty explicitly just to avoid integration schools.
Segregation test.
Yeah, segregation again. So is that true of your experience? Anybody on this panel?
So that was not true of the Christian school that I went to. However, my father is from the Mississippi Delta, and he was an explicit white supremacist who literally believed that slavery never should have been outlawed. Yeah. So that was definitely part of the fabric of my childhood. Luckily, my mother was not in agreement, but it was still something that I was expected to pay lip service to around him. So I, like you, am really interested in the ways that these schools and homeschooling that I think Chrissy and others can speak to more, perpetuate that kind of separation and that kind of supremacist thinking.
What I can say about Christian schools, you know, starting to be founded in the 1960s, particularly as segregation academies, and then many more across the country from the 1970s, 1980s, some of them have, different sorts of origins and weren't necessarily so racist in their origins or explicitly segregationist. But from what research I've been doing into Christian schools, and it's hard to get really specific data on Christian schools, but anecdotally, I mean, I've heard of racism being experienced in many of them that are not, in the Old South. And the one that I got from, I mean, it's called Heritage Christian School, right? And it was definitely almost all white people when I was there in the 1980s and 1990s, somewhat more integrated now. And so it's changed in some ways, but I think the white supremacy was very much implicitly there in its founding. They probably still do a reenactment of the so-called, First Thanksgiving, where kids dress up as both Indians as well as pilgrims. Yeah, I've heard of a lot of other really racist things that happen at some of these schools, including like slave auction fundraisers, and they're not all in the South. Yeah. We did a hashtag expose Christian schools in 2019. It got like 200,000 tweets in like 2 days, and there are some wild stories there. So yeah, sometimes definitely part.
Thank you so much. I would love to hear some of those stories if you don't mind turning my hair later. But I think this also speaks to such a useful thread that's kind of been popping up throughout, which has had to do with this sort of general distinction between what distinguishes fundamentalism from evangelical Christianity, to what extent are they playmates or bedfellows, and then also some of the social climbing that I was talking about earlier in the day. And I'm sure most of you are fairly familiar with this split given the context, but I think it's interesting, the 20s and the 30s being the sort of first big rupture between the fundamentalists and the evangelicalists, where those were the actual terms in play, both of them being far more conservative than, say, the religion of the founding fathers. So it's not as if there was this long unbroken strain of this particular type of religious conservatism that had existed time immemorial. And in fact, it was only a few blocks from here at Old North First Presbyterian Church back in 22 that Shall the Fundamentalists Win was delivered. And of course, the pastor afterwards was politely asked to resign later that year and had to go join the Baptists uptown. And you think about like the context of the 20s and the 30s, like women getting the vote, beginnings of a real potential for like a socialist labor movement in the United States. And then this real separation for about 30, 40 years of fundamentalists and evangelicals, which have as much to do with social and class ties as they do with anything else. And then this sort of like slow but steady reunion of sorts beginning in the 60s, again, over like plausibly deniable segregation. And so you will get different variations of, yes, we're going to call ourselves Heritage Academy. Yes, we are explicitly, white dominionist. But then you will just as easily get, the nice J. Crew church in town that looks like a college campus, which I grew up in Hoffman Estates, which happened to be a sundown town. But I didn't learn that because anyone in my family or community said, this is a sundown town. I learned that in high school when I found out what sundown towns were. So I think there's a real case of like, this original split at one point eventually became sort of like one hand washing the other. And I think in a lot of ways you can think of fundamentalism as the attack dog of evangelicalism, which can be the sort of like friendly face that eventually gets you into like, I would have said borders, but that's like 15 years old. I'm out of the game. Yes, so there's some really fascinating research about this, but sundown towns historically are a part of the sort of like patchwork, non-Southern specified like Jim Crow, let's say traditions throughout the country that wouldn't necessarily be like on the books, but towns that would in the middle of the century have signs that said, don't let the sun go down on you in this town, and then usually a racial slur would follow. And so it was explicitly understood that if you were a non-white person, you could come into town to work for a white family during the day. But if you were there after the sun set, you could be harassed, arrested, hurt, killed. And there is a huge network of sundown towns throughout the Midwest and the central and the western parts of this country. It was not by any means a primarily Southern phenomenon. And of course, within a generation or two, the signs come down, The white parents don't necessarily tell their white children, hey, that sign used to be here. The families of color in the area do pass that information down. So then you even get a generation or two of white kids who again are born into this sort of like fantasy of white innocence, which is, I didn't see anything. Like there just happens to be only white people, who knows why? And again, I think there's a lot of that in that sort of like attack dog and friendly face venues of separatist Christianity.
Very well said, thank you. Greece.
Thank you. This has been really fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing these stories. It's really scary to hear these narratives. And I think one of the reasons why it seems so scary to me is that, you know, we live in this extraordinary moment in history where it seems very realistic and in some ways maybe even inevitable that the democratic institutions that we have held on to in a fragile way for some decades are collapsing. And the possibility of confronting fascism, white supremacy, militancy seems to recede. And so one of the things that is both moving and also challenging about this conversation is that it seems to me that what we can do, what we know how to do, is talk about the ethical complexities involved in leading a fascist organization. But what we can't do, what we're in a sense prohibited from doing, is talking about how to confront fascism. And so I guess what I'm interested in hearing you think about, and I think, you know, Danny, you were sort of gesturing in that direction just now as well, you know, at the level of public policy, rather than at the level of how do we talk to an individual who is considering leaving a church, at the level of like collectively, how do we actually confront this profound evil that damages the lives of millions and millions of people? How do we confront that collectively? And how does that require us to change maybe the language that we use to describe religion? I mean, in a sense, it seems fair enough to me to say, you know, we have to invite people into conversations and we have to make coalitions with people who we don't agree with. I'm all about that. I totally agree with that. And at the same time, in a way, listening to these stories, it seems as though the religious dimension of the thing that we're calling conservative Christianity is the least important part of it. It's like, you know, these people decide to wear blue at the weekend. You know, it's like, okay, that's not the thing. The thing is that this is white supremacy and this is fascism and this is an attempt to uproot democracy and any possibility of social justice from ever occurring. You know, again, the question is only, how do we make that move from the individual to the collective as a response to this?
So to sum up what was a very eloquent question, how do we confront the Christian right from a more public policy perspective rather than talking to individuals about leaving the church?
I mean, you know, because they do lobby as conservative Christians, and the beliefs and practices mean a lot to them. As I mean, someone who grew up there, I definitely remember what it was like to feel that and to believe that way. I don't know that I agree that the religion is the least important part, but I think it does in this case is, yes, it serves as a profoundly powerful vehicle for the perpetuation of bigotry, white supremacy, and so forth. Sometimes in kinder, gentler packaging, you know, like, oh yes, Martin Luther King, we love him, he would have been on our sides. You know, I grew up with, you know, claiming that we're not racist, but very against, you know, anti-racists and anti-social, and very like against, you know, social justice. What I've been focused on is trying to get people to understand that, yeah, Christianity can indeed be racist and white supremacist and, you know, anti-woman and anti-queer and anti-democracy and anti-human rights. And so to me, that's why it's important that we don't, you know, downplay the Christianity or dismiss these kinds of Christians as fake Christians, because they are powerful, they are organized as Christians, and they're trying to impose, you know, sort of theocratic, authoritarian minority rule on the United States, and being very successful, at least at the state level right now. And, you know, and if they gain national power again, I mean, a national abortion ban is already being discussed by Republicans. It's very much on the table. I expect the same kind of attacks on trans rights to happen at the national level that have been happening in states like Florida and Texas. How do you fight that in terms of policy? I mean, I think we do need a robust discourse about democracy and human rights and civics and all of that sort of stuff again. And I think we also just need the public to understand, exactly who they're up against and how they're organized, and the ideology of it. And we have to, and we need to do that in order to distance ourselves from this idea that Christian is a synonym for good person. We've got to decouple those things. So to me, my focus has been on trying to change the conversation to the extent that I can play a role in that, in the hopes that changing the discourse will eventually make a better politics possible. It's a long game sort of thing rather than a direct, well, you can change the policy now, because there are obviously state and local political battles you can fight, but I think ultimately we have to change how people think to create better political possibilities in the future.
I have this really good friend who was raised in a fundamentalist tradition and has broken from it entirely. But I remember years ago her saying to me, Roe v. Wade is going to be overturned. Like, she had absolutely no doubt. And it was long enough ago that I was like, I believe that we hate women as a culture and are attacking them at every turn. So I believe that I understand the gist of what you're saying, but do you really think that's possible? And she was like, they are so organized. She was like, I feel like people outside this tradition do not take them seriously and do not understand how organized they are and how they are playing the long game. And she was like, I really feel like even people, who would be horrified by this happening, really, I think are a little smug about it and actually don't fully understand what is happening. And of course she was proven to be right. And I think that there is also something about, again, this is not a policy thing, it's take them seriously, but one of the hardest things is watching how absolutely organized they are. And it's really frustrating for my own political, I really wish any political affiliation I had was as nearly as organized as the religious right. And as these groups of people who do have these again, because they have these incredibly sort of essentialist, white supremacist goals, are so focused because who they represent is such a narrow field. And so they're constantly advancing this incredibly narrow identity sort of structure, and are successful. And again, I play the long game. I have been working on it for so long. So it's not really a policy thing, but it's I think part of it too is it's easy to be that's so ridiculous, because it is so ridiculous. There's so many ridiculous things about it, but it's also an extremely serious problem. And I think Roe v. Wade getting overturned, and and again, also watching the sort of these, you mentioned the trans rights at the state level, it's we take this extremely seriously. And when some people are, but people I feel definitely are oh, it's just happening in these states, or it's just happening, and it's no, this is gonna happen everywhere. And even the fact of people, I feel people be well, then okay, if you're in a state that's has an abortion ban, fuck those people. It's well, first of all, no, but also this is also going to become the whole country. It's not as if it's just these states. So I think people get very smug and get very focused on especially people who don't live in states, southern states or states where their rights are constantly being challenged. But I think we have to be really specific about the realities of what we're actually looking at. And I feel not to be, sometimes I worry it's too late, honestly, which I hate to say that. And I feel I'm a piece of shit saying that out loud, but I do actually really feel it's too late for a lot of these fights, which actually really scares me. So that's not a very helpful answer, but sorry. Also, I'm we're all gonna be climate refugees in 15 years. So I don't know, I'm a little bit, unfortunately, that's where my brain is.
Why don't you go and then I'll say my.
I was just thinking in connection with what Chrissy had just been saying, which was one of the things that I think has been heartening to witness in the last couple of years on my end has been the amount of people meeting Christianists and they're sort of ground level salvos. So as Chrissy had mentioned, they often start with legislation in a couple of key states that often doesn't pass, but that is a sort of a starter's pistol, and then the other amendments come rolling in. And so one of the things that I think the evangelical fundamentalist communities do really well is they get organized at the level of school boards, textbook review, and public libraries. And obviously, I think most of us know that that's been a huge battleground for the last couple of years, specifically in terms of so-called critical race theory, in terms of anything around the lines of either trans content in books or drag queen story hour, and then more recently, anything with any sort of like queer content, including that mural that was recently under review. And so I think truly, this is one of those things that can feel a little bit more heartening, which is like, you don't have to become a lawyer and like go fight it in court. You don't have to become incredibly well-versed in like Christian history or tradition, but like getting involved with your local library, getting involved with your local schools, getting involved in like textbook review boards. And that's where they have their people on the ground trying to, first of all, you know, limit what children can and cannot hear or learn about, but also as like a test ground for figuring out what can we try to remove from the public sphere of conversation. And that is often a place where you can see most immediate direct action being done, and where you often get to just like, we need 50 people to show up at this library to make sure that this like particular, you know, event can happen without people getting harassed, and then pushing back and making it clear we're not just going to be like at the farmer's market, as the sort of like suspicion on their part goes. And I mean, you know, Carmen, I really showed like total fear of like, and news caps are melting, that's big. But I also think like, you know, the climate crisis is ongoing, is happening. We all have to find a way to living, and they're going to use that. You know, I don't know, and I know it's always like tempting to think like, if I just know the world's going to end in 15 years, I can kind of give up. Which like I remember from, you know, Christianist traditions, they like doing that, and so that's something that I do try to resist in my own mind, which is just to say like, they will use any climate crisis as an excuse to say we need Christo-fascism and we need it now, and there needs to be a lot of people showing up to, you know, steamroll them. And then my just last thought is like, you know, if you can get your father fired from his church, start there. You know, it begins at home. I'm sorry, just bragging now.
Yeah, I mean, I love that we're all having this conversation. Grace, thank you for that really important question. You know, I love Danny's tips, and I share Carmen's fear. One thing that's really, that I've come to over the past few years, particularly in relation to quote unquote critical race theory, which has been expanded to mean any teaching of uncomfortable history around race, is that I think it's really easy for people on the left to be like, what can we do? How do, you know, and I think there's totally a place for exactly what you're talking about, Grace, this sort of, you know, we need a large scale, effective mobilization and opposition. At the same time, I have come around to the idea that one thing each of us can do is be really brave about telling our own stories. And, you know, in particular, I'm not calling myself brave, but in particular, people like me who have a history of ancestors who enslaved people, ancestors who committed genocide, you know, rather than me getting on Twitter and hectoring everyone about white supremacy, what I can say is, look, this is what my ancestors did, you know, and this is how I feel about that. And these are the questions that I ask myself about my own responsibility as a result of those histories. And I think that, you know, the more people are willing to really take that on and have difficult conversations, not only with the people who agree with them, but with, you know, the people at the dog run who want to minimize slavery and its legacy, or the people at the grocery store who are making a homophobic or trans-hating remark. You know, really, I do think there's a certain amount of one-on-one, really uncomfortable communication that has to happen, especially because fascism is metastasizing so quickly. And it's hard to know how to respond to it at a sort of broad level. But I feel like telling our personal stories has the power for some of those stories to take hold in the broader imagination and on the community level as well.
Excellent. I think we have time for one more question. Joshua, I think you had your hand up.
I did. He kind of scooped me. I was gonna bring up Christian white evangelicalism, fascism, and creeping paranoia, but he already brought it up. But I want to bring. Oh, it's okay. Well, on a more personal level, have you? I grew up with a lot of people who that culture who are now extremely paranoid and say often fascist or racist things. So on a personal level, you guys been able to maintain relationships, or have you wanted to? And have you found of any benefit to do so? Anyone like that in your life, any older generation, other than your parents?
I'm most equipped to answer that just because of the extreme nature of my background. As I said, I don't have a relationship with my father. I don't have a relationship with anyone I went to the Christian school with who is still in that world. I have a precarious relationship with my Trump voting mother and stepfather. So, the reality is that on a personal level, my sharing of my own feelings and story with people like that doesn't seem to, result in any kind of positive change, but, hope springs eternal, I guess.
The evangelical side of my family is my mom's side, and I'm still, occasionally in touch with like my aunts and uncles, cousins, but I'm pretty hopeless about the prospects of most of them ever changing their minds on anything. I think my parents are the only ones on that side of the family who got the COVID vaccine, for example. I happened to be in Indiana last Christmas because I got invited to a conference at Notre Dame in December, which was a very weird confluence of events. So I spent Christmas with them. Some of my cousins, sort of more in the middle, but aunts and uncles pretty darn far gone. And I don't know. I mean, I'm in touch with a few people, but I don't know that it's helpful, basically. I guess my parents changed a little.
Yeah, my mother's family is very religious, and there's a lot of like QAnon. It's actually interesting because they're like mostly very Catholic, and there's a couple of who broke from Catholicism and became like evangelical fundamentalists. And they've all kind of gone in the kind of QAnon direction also. And I'm just not in communication with those people. I think for me, I feel like, I don't know, I've had conversations where I feel like I've been shamed a little for like not trying to like be in there, like trying to make it. And I'm like, I don't have time or patience. Like I have like one wild and precious life. And like, I simply cannot spend it like being called homophobic slurs by my worst cousin, like this is not the way I want to spend my time on this earth on the last 15 years I have remaining before the disaster. So anyway, that's not a choice that I've made. And it's funny because I do have like this one really good friend I've had for many years who I said became a very conservative Catholic. And I mean, our friendship in some ways exists in spite of it, and we just know each other since we were like 3 years old. So it's one of those kinds of relationships, but also it is really hard because on some level, like our values just simply do not align anymore. And it's like harder and harder, I think, to find kind of common grounds. And like also a lot of my life I can't share with her because we just have no way of talking about it in a normal human way. So it's been hard.
I do. So actually I love that question. I do think it's very much like in communication with graces, because there's that question of where do you draw a dividing line? So much of it can be acutely personal and has so much to do, again, as like Carmen was saying, just has to do with like, are these people treating you well? Do you feel like you occasionally talk about other things? But I also think it's really important not to get caught up in like a reverse Christian mindset of like the lost sheep, whereby like it would be most redemptive, most meaningful if I could chisel away one of the most committed Christianists and win them over to our side. And I think, again, like it's a valuable and interesting story. I'm not saying get rid of it entirely, but I would just say, if it's a question of like, these are not people who listen to me, we've tried having the same conversation 50 times and I've never gotten anywhere, I think probably that time and energy would be better spent with people who are maybe in the middle of the road but need encouragement to like become part of like, you know, showing up to help out at the library or the school board, or for somebody who's like, well, I have a sort of like personal religious faith and I go to like a non-insane church, but like I don't really know what to think about, you know, this issue, but I'm open to hearing about it. That I think is often the place where the most sort of like one-on-one, like personal winning can be done. But don't get into the business of like, I must convert souls to this new cause. When I used to convert souls for the old cause, that was wrong. But now I got to find the people who like it the least, change their mind through my like Thunder and William James Bryan testimony for the right way, which again, I can totally depend upon. So I get that. Anyway, said that.
I will just say I have ruined a lot of Thanksgivings and it has never changed anything. Grace, you had a follow.
Yeah, I just sort of quickly had a thought, which I mean, I guess there's two parts of it. The first part of it is, it seems to me that some of the things that, if this was the reverse thing, and there was sort of 4 conservative Christians talking about how to defeat the radical homosexual agenda, they would be talking about seizing assets, ending tax breaks. They would be talking about legislative efforts to make sure that people could not promulgate their ideologies in schools. And these are the things I think we can be talking about. I actually think we can talk about ending tax breaks for churches at state and federal levels. I think we can talk about rights for children to be protected from religious indoctrination. And I think these are the kinds of conversations that we might want to have. And then the second thing, just to, you know, in the spirit of William Jennings Bryan, or maybe the opposite, just one of my favorite quotes from Karl Marx, and there are a few that I love, but one of my absolute favorites from the contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx says, criticism of this kind is a hand-to-hand combat, and in such combat, it doesn't matter whether one's opponent is noble or interesting. The point is to hit him. And in that spirit, I think, you know, I guess I want to champion and affirm Carmen's decision not to go into the fray. You know, we have less of a responsibility to convert the fallen than we do to defend the vulnerable.
We have less of a responsibility to convert the fallen than we do to defend the vulnerable. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, everyone. I hope we will have many more conversations like this. And will you guys be able to stick around a little if you want to chat, sign books? Excellent.
Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Thank
This
you.
is awesome. Thank you all. It's wonderful to hear all of you.